In my opinion, the Zionist movement, which had to accept entering into negotiations because of the first Intifada, because of the challenge that Palestinian struggle represented, and because the Israeli occupation could not continue to function as it did before because of the high cost, they maneuvered and accepted negotiations, but only to diffuse the results of the first Intifada. And in my opinion, the Palestinian side, of course, committed a big mistake by signing Oslo Agreement without insisting on what Dr. Haider Abdel-Shafi used to insist on, which is complete and total freeze of all settlement activities. More than that, that agreement was sort of imbalanced because Palestinians recognized the state of Israel, while Israel did not recognize a Palestinian state. All it did was to recognize PLO as representative of the Palestinians. Anyhow, the paralysis of Oslo process, the paralysis of negotiations, and then the big invasion of Area A and B, where the Palestinian Authority was in charge by Mr. Sharon in 2002, resembled a very clear intention from the Israeli side not to proceed with the peace process. But most important, since 1967 and up till now, the Israeli government continued to expand settlements. And even after Oslo Agreement was signed. And during the last 4 years, we witnessed even the sharpest and unprecedented level of expanding existing settlements and building new settlements. In reality, we have now about 250 settlements, old and new, including no less than 120 new settlement outposts that were created during the so-called peace process. That continuation of settlement expansion, which led now to the fact that there are 750,000 illegal settlers living on the occupied Palestinian territories in the West Bank, is a clear indicator of the real intentions of the governments of Israel. Of course, the other factor that pushed the issue of annexation was the big green light from the side of the American administration after Trump was elected. Unfortunately, before Trump came in, President Obama failed drastically in fulfilling his promise of insisting on freezing settlement activities. The promise he made on the first year of his presidency in the meeting of Cairo, in a lecture in Cairo University, was not implemented. He retreated under Israeli Zionist pressure. So the settlements continued. And then came Trump, who proposed the deal of the century, or what I call the deceit of the century, which represented a very clear violation of international law. It violated and ignored no less than 82 resolutions of the Security Council, as well as no less than 700 resolutions by the United Nations General Assembly, all of which insist that settlements are illegal and should be removed, that Palestinians have a right to a state of their own on the land occupied in 1967, including East Jerusalem, etc., etc. The attack of annexation started much earlier than Netanyahu's declaration. It started when Mr. Trump and his team recognized the annexation of East Jerusalem, which is an occupied territory, and their decision of moving the embassy to Jerusalem, the American embassy. It started with the Israeli approval and the American acceptance and support of the annexation of the Syrian Golan Heights, which are also occupied territories. And unfortunately, these two actions were not met by more than shy criticism from the international community, but no real actions against this very grave and serious violation of international law. In my opinion, the annexation and the recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights was a test to the international community. And the international community has failed. And that's why Netanyahu moved forward with declaring his plan of initiating the annexation of big parts of the West Bank. In my opinion, Netanyahu is trying now to use several things as contributing factors to pushing the issue of illegal annexation. First, he thinks that the world is too busy with the issue of COVID-19 and the fight with this pandemic. And he thinks that distracts the attention of the world from what's happening in Palestine. Second, he is very worried that Trump might lose elections. And he is trying to use the remaining time for Mr. Trump to ensure that annexation takes place. Third, Netanyahu is relying on a very serious shift of the Israeli public towards racist extremism, which obviously is clear from the results of Israeli elections. But more than that, from many polls that show that maybe about 70% of Jewish Israelis would support annexation. In this regard, there is no difference between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gantz, or even the Labour Party of Israel. The three parties are together in this government, which is planning annexation. And I always had the opinion that Gantz and Netanyahu represent two faces of the same coin, contrary to what some people thought. The main effort of the American administration during the last few months was to push Mr. Gantz to go into coalition with Netanyahu and to agree on the principle and idea of annexation. But there is a fourth factor why Netanyahu is rushing, which is that he is indicted with 4 accusations of very serious corruption. And maybe he is trying to distract the public attention in Israel from his corruption cases. And also, maybe he thinks that annexation would be his legacy if he is, if these cases are confirmed. Now, what does the annexation mean? It's very important for people to understand the real Israeli plans in this regard. They're not talking only about annexing the Jordan Valley. It's more than that. But the Jordan Valley per se, which Netanyahu said it should be annexed, and which Trump's plan supports the annexation, I mean, says that it would be annexed. I mean, I read this plan carefully and every line of it. It allows Israel the annexation of the Jordan Valley, which is nothing less than 29% of the size of the occupied West Bank. It also includes 1/3 of our water in the West Bank, 1/3 of water resources. And it has a very serious amount of land devoted to agriculture. I would say that no less than 50% of all vegetables and many other products are produced in the Jordan Valley. But it also includes the annexation of what remained of the Dead Sea, which is supposed to be also partially part of the Palestinian state. The more strategic threat here is that it would mean annexing the would-be last remaining borders between what would become a Palestinian state and the external world. It would enclave Palestinians within Israeli complete domination. But Netanyahu does not want only to annex the Jordan Valley. The Israeli government practically wants to annex the Jordan Valley, the illegal Israeli settlements, the 250 of them, the state land, as they call it, and the very wide area in the West Bank, which is considered military bases or military installation or areas prohibited for Palestinians for military and security causes, as they claim. We're talking here about 62% of the West Bank including East Jerusalem. 62%. So practically, Netanyahu wants to annex everything except this little area, which is called Area A and B. But what does that mean? What are the implications of such a move? The first implication would be there is no place for a Palestinian independent state. This means the end of the idea of a Palestinian statehood. And this would mean the final destruction of the two-state solution. It's an aim, it's a plan that aims at killing the two-state solution. But more than that, it would send a message to the Palestinian people that we cheated you. We, the Zionists, cheated you. We made you think that we can reach a compromise. And although you accepted, the Palestinians, a very painful compromise of having a little tiny state in West Bank and Gaza, which is only 22% of historic Palestine, regardless of the fact that the UN gave you, the Palestinians, 44%, you accepted 22%, but this is not acceptable to the Israelis. The idea of a peaceful compromise is finished and killed here. The third outcome would be the consolidation of a system of apartheid. Two laws for two people living in the same area. And more than that, cutting the West Bank and consolidating the West Bank in 224 small ghetto stands, as I call them. You can call them panto stands if you like that. You can call them ghettos. But I think the suitable name, given the nature of the history here, is that these are 224 ghetto stands with one big ghetto stand in Gaza. There can be no Palestinian state with such a situation, of course. And in addition to that, there will be no Palestinian sovereignty whatsoever, even in these ghetto stands. The roadmap, the Trump's plan and the Israeli plan is very clearly indicating that Israel will maintain the overall security of the whole area. Even what they call a Palestinian state, according to Trump's plan, would never be established as a name till 4 years of negotiations take place, until Palestinians accept 52 conditions, which no Palestinian can accept unless he is or she is a horrible collaborator. The 52 conditions include accepting the annexation of Jerusalem, accepting the annexation of the Jordan Valley, accepting the annexation of settlements, accepting the liquidation of all rights of Palestinian refugees, accepting Jerusalem as the unified capital of Israel only, and accepting the national Israeli law, which means that the right of self-determination on the land of historic Palestine is exclusive for Jewish people. I think this is very dangerous because, and this is my fourth point in terms of implication, this would mean that Israel is allowed to violate international law and it can annex land by force. A principle that has been rejected by the world international community since the end of the Second World War. If that happens without implications, it would mean that the world community is back to the law of jungle. And if Europe is protesting Russia's position in the Crimea, how can it justify accepting what Israel is going to do? That is a big question to everybody. The fourth implication would definitely be, or the fifth implication actually would be, of course, enhancing extremism, weakening those who believed in peace, those who believed in compromise, and unfortunately, with a system of apartheid, where you have practically 50% of the population, which are the Palestinian people living on the land of Palestine, will be subjected to a system of racial discrimination and oppression and apartheid. And that would mean that a long protracted, of course, conflict. But more than that, the only outcome of this would be either the Palestinians would be able to stop and end the system of apartheid in one-state solution, or the Israelis will be planning and maybe conducting huge amount of ethnic cleansing in several ways, similar to what happened in 1948 in historic Palestine. Today, all Palestinians are unified without exception in rejecting this horrible annexation and rejecting the so-called Trump's plan. And most recently, we had a positive development, something we've been calling for a long time, which is that Hamas and Fatah has agreed in a joint press conference that they will join all of us, the other forces, together in fighting annexation and in struggling against this system of apartheid. It's not a full step, but it's an important beginning, which could lead, hopefully, to the creation of a unified Palestinian leadership. That is something we in the Palestinian National Initiative are calling for since long time, and we hope it will materialize. Our belief is that the only strategy that would succeed is the strategy that will change the balance of power on the ground. Israel would not have dared to speak about annexation if the balance of power between Palestinians and Israelis was different from what we have. And we think that the right strategy should be a comprehensive one that concentrates on changing the balance of power through wide popular nonviolent resistance all over Palestine, with enhancing a system of boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israeli government and against this Israeli apartheid and against Israeli occupation. And the third point is to consolidate and help Palestinians survive and stay in Palestine, because one of the main goals of the Israeli policy is to put people under very difficult economic situations, economic pressure, so that they would immigrate and leave. Today, I think we have to say that this all would not have happened if the international community have reacted in a different way to the issue of settlement, illegal settlement activities, or the annexation of the Golan Heights, or the annexation of East Jerusalem. And today, what we need is to change this course. Our demand to the international community, and especially to European countries, is first of all, for all of them to immediately recognize the state of Palestine. I mean, those countries that have not yet recognized Palestine, as Sweden has done, they should recognize Palestine immediately. I'm talking about countries like Germany, France, Italy, Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland, etc. We do not understand why these countries still hesitate to recognize Palestine if they say they support the two-state solution. And since they already recognize Israel. Recognition of Palestine is not a unilateral act. It's consolidating the nature of the situation where international law says that these are occupied territories and the occupation should end. But the second thing we need, which is even more important than recognition, is that the world community, and especially Europe, would impose immediately sanctions on Israel. The moment the annexation starts, and I am sure it will start soon, there should be sanctions declared immediately. Why I say the European Union? Because the European Union today represents the largest trade partner with Israel. The European Union has many agreements with Israel. Trade agreements. Israel is allowed to be privileged in terms of trade with the European Union. They have many privileges, many exclusive privileges. So what we demand is to cancel these agreements. Tell Israel that if you proceed with annexation, not only there will be consequences, as is said today, but specify what are the consequences, and specifically cancellation of these agreements. Second, there should be immediate and total military suspension of all forms of military cooperation between Israel and any country in the world. Whether you are talking about import or export or training together or maneuvers or whatever. You cannot have military relations with a country that is violating international law in this manner. Third, Europe has huge scientific and research agreements with Israel. I don't think I exaggerate if I say we're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. That naturally has to be stopped. And these are the things that would make Netanyahu and Israel rethink the possibility of annexation. Finally, Israel is treated as a privileged country when it comes to visas to Europe. You know how much we, the Palestinians, suffer to get a visa to any European country in general, with the exception, of course, of few people. But Israelis can get visas just like that, or I don't know if they even don't need visa in many places. We believe that any Israeli who works in settlements, who lives in a settlement, should be denied the ability to enter, the entry ability to enter Europe or any other country. These would be clear sanctions that could have an impact and could change the course. Today, Israel has created the worst system of apartheid in the 21st century. As a matter of fact, as our friends from South Africa tell us when they visit us, and I'm quoting here my friend Ronnie Kastler, who was a minister in Mr. Mandela's government, or even today's ministers in the South African government, they always said the apartheid system in Palestine is much worse than the apartheid system that prevailed in South Africa. And South African apartheid system would not have been brought down if it wasn't for BDS and sanctions that was imposed on the apartheid system. Sweden was always in the avant-garde, and we're very proud of you, in the avant-garde of protecting and demanding respect of human rights. Sweden has always been a country that was an avant-garde in respecting democratic rights. And you were ahead of many nations in imposing sanctions on South Africa when it had a system of apartheid. And that's why I think today we hope that Sweden can also take the lead in this direction. One last point. It's very important for Sweden to sustain its support to very vital, important humanitarian needs and also important needs in the field of health, education, human rights, etc. This is very important to sustain the ability of the people here to survive all the pressures they are subjected to. I think I will stop here, and I will be very glad to answer any of your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mustafa, for this clear presentation. And I think the message from you, what you want us to do, is quite clear. We have to keep on pushing for sanctions and to keep on working with the BDS work that we do in PGS. So now everyone can put your questions, and we will see with Per. Do we have any questions already? Microphone.
Sorry, yeah, I have questions on two sides here, so I'm looking at my phone as well. 1 second, I'll find this one. So we have one question here. What other measures than sanctions should be used to put pressure on Israel to stop the occupation, the illegal settlements, and the blockade? You've mentioned many of these things, but this comes from an activist view. I'm sure you're aware of Dr. Barghouti, that the PTS has about 17 or 18 local groups all over Sweden. So that's like an idea for tactics.
Well, I think, as I said, well, when we speak about sanctions, we are talking about a very long list of things that should be done. For instance, you have companies that were declared by the United Nations of companies that work in Israeli illegal settlements, like Airbnb. I think the sanctions should also include these companies, and there should be letters to these companies that unless you remove yourself from Israeli illegal settlements, you will be sanctioned as well. You have banks. Most recently, the Dutch investment bank, I think, decided to divest from two major Israeli banks, Leumi and Abu Alim, because they work in Israeli settlements. Before that, Norwegian investment fund decided the same thing. So there is a very long list of things that can be done through sanctions, and not only boycotting Israeli products, and if they do annexation, we're not talking only about settlement products, but about all Israeli products. Sanctioning and boycotting cultural activities, sanctioning and boycotting music activities, literature activities. Exactly like was done with South Africa. So the two major things I believe should be done is, first of all, to support Palestinians survive the pressure they're going to have in so many different ways that people can do, as they wish. And second is to impose the sanctions on Israel. But also it is important, and that is for activist groups, it is so important to bring the right narrative to the public, to the people, especially to the younger generation. You have in Sweden already the rise of some very extreme parties that are adopting, being racist, and they are still adopting the Israeli approach. And they support Israel. This is a phenomena that you see in Europe. And I think one has to use today and link, and this is a very important point, and I thank you for raising this question. It's very important to link the Palestinian struggle against racism with this worldwide, I call it revolution, that is happening worldwide against racism in principle. And to show that when you fight against racism, you're fighting not only against racism towards African Americans or Black people, and not only against racism towards immigrants, but also against racism towards Palestinians, where the worst system of apartheid has been established. I think linking Palestinian struggle to the issue of worldwide struggle against racism is very important. And that requires bringing the real narrative to the people, to the younger generation, to the students in schools, in universities, everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Dr. Barghouti. And we can say to the attendees here that if you look at the web page or any of the social media platforms for PTS, you will find some of these kinds of campaigns that Mustafa has mentioned. We in the PTS work closely with ECCP, Europe, and BNC on many of these kinds of campaigns. So do you, Anna, have a question while I check out the rest of the Q&A things here.
No, I think you can take the Q&A questions. One question is, how important do you think, Mustafa, that it is that activists and organizations works together with the BDS movement that is led by Palestinians and working together in organizations like the ECCP?
Well, it's very useful to be working together and to coordinate. We are part of the Palestinian Secretariat that is leading the BDS movement here locally and internationally. So yes, coordination would be a very good thing. But I also believe that each country has its own conditions and we should be flexible in this manner and give a big space for the local leadership in each country to develop the tactics they prefer in terms of which forms of BDS they should use. But besides that, coordinated European actions would be very useful. We've seen changes in Europe. I mean, nobody expected, and we're doing a lot of lobbying work here. Nobody expected the Dutch parliament, for instance, to come up with a resolution against annexation that demanded that the Dutch government provides the parliament with the list of measures of sanctions that will be used if annexation takes place. Nobody believed we could influence, as we did, the Christian Democratic Party in Holland in supporting such a resolution. We were not that successful in Germany because still the resolution that was taken in German parliament is much weaker. But there is a very good scope. But all of that, you see, you have to understand, you have a very powerful Israeli lobby that is functioning in Europe, in the United States, and in many other places. And there has to be a strong activist work constantly with members of parliament, with the ministers in governments, with decision makers, to encounter the Israeli narrative and to demand what should be done for the rights of the Palestinian people.
And in Sweden, there are still a lot of organizations that don't fully support BDS, but still when we argue and we know that some even don't support BDS fully, but still we can work for banning the trade with the settlements, because it's not even a sanction, it's like a criminal act to do that. So I think this is important also.
That's right, and when Netanyahu starts annexation, he will be also committing the mother of war crimes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And I have a question here. We're jumping to another quite big subject here. And this question says, what is the solution to the Palestinian political situation after the Palestinian people lost faith in their leadership, it says. And this is what we always hear and watch from people. And when will the democratic change be? That is one question.
Well, you know, I'm a very long time activist in demanding democracy internally. Not only talking about it, but practicing the issue in the different election processes that took place before. We have a bad situation here when it comes to the issue of internal democracy, because the internal division has unfortunately been used to liquidate the only elected body in Palestine, which is the Palestinian Parliament, the PLC. And we did not have elections since 2006. And this weakens us, of course. Now we are confronting annexation without having what we should have had, which is our elections. In my opinion, the natural path should be immediate formation of unified national leadership that should include all the parties without exception, including those who are in the PLO and those who are outside the PLO. Lead the struggle against annexation immediately, but at the same time prepare the ground for the elections. We need three types of elections. We need presidential elections, we need parliamentary elections, and we need elections of the Palestinian National Council, which is the General Assembly of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. There is a big demand for that, especially by the younger generation. And I do agree that young people in Palestine are not having their access to the possibility of participating in policymaking or in leadership positions. And the only solution to that is free democratic elections. And that should be our goal. Moving into the establishing a unified leadership now will make that task easier, because then it will take away the idea of internal division as a justification for not having democratic processes. And I always said that Palestinian struggle unifies Palestinians, and the fight over the Palestinian Authority divides us. Unfortunately, today the Palestinian Authority is an authority under occupation. And it is itself admitting that it is an authority without real authority. So that's why we need now a unified national front, but we need to develop the democratic processes as soon as possible. And we have to take into consideration, maybe this will take a long time to continue the struggle. So we cannot just wait and not have democracy. So we have to find creatively the right approach which allow democratic processes to take place and allows people to decide who should be their leaders and who should be the leader of their struggle in the coming period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is one question here. I just lost it. It's good. It's many questions now. There's one question. Why wait for annexation to impose sanctions? Why not directly or yesterday to stop occupation and settlements which are bad enough? If annexation will come in bits, the world will not react.
Nobody said you should wait. I've been asking for sanctions since 1999, since 21 years. We've been talking about the creation of system of apartheid since 1999.
Yeah.
So nobody should wait. If you can impose sanctions immediately, please. But those countries that still hesitate even to criticize Israel, I mean, we should tell them, at least if the annexation takes place, you should immediately impose sanctions.
Right.
Yes, thank you. Next question is the Palestine National Initiative linked to the Arab list in the 48 area? How is the cooperation in struggle between people in the West Bank and Gaza and 48 area?
Palestinian National Initiative exists in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza Strip, abroad among the Palestinian diaspora. But we have members from 1948, which is very, very special. I mean, in difference from many other parties in Palestine, in difference from other parties, I would say. So we do have members from 1948 areas, but we do respect the unified list and we cooperate with them. And we think our idea in the Palestinian National Initiative that this stage of struggle requires to unify the struggle of Palestinians, whether they live in the occupied territories or inside 48 areas in what is called Israel, or in the diaspora. And actually, Oslo Agreement dissociated Palestinians from each other and created a wrong impression as if the Palestinian struggle is related only to the West Bank and Gaza. This has alienated many Palestinians abroad. And one of the parts of our strategy is to reunify Palestinians together around the same goals. And I tell you very frankly, if Israel kills the two-state solution, and it is actually killing the two-state solution while we are watching that, the only alternative for us will be to demand one democratic state on the land of historic Palestine, with full and total equal rights for both people, without exception. But when I say equal rights, it would mean not only equal civil rights, but also equal national rights. And if they think that we will live as slaves of a system of apartheid or as slaves of a system of occupation forever, they are mistaken. We will never, the Palestinians will never accept to be slaves of that system. And the world community must clearly say that it is Israel that killed that option of two states. But they should never think that if they kill that idea of a Palestinian statehood, that we will just surrender and accept to live in ghettos. No, 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 no. It will bring us back to the original Palestinian goal, or slogan if you want. One democratic state with full equal rights for everybody. No apartheid.
There's actually one question about this. When is like the limit or the end when that is what you are going to demand? Like one
for me it was yesterday. But we have to find a way first to convince all other groups in Palestine that we should get together to a unified national goal, which is the one I spoke about.
Yeah.
But as you know, we cannot alone decide. This requires a national consensus. And we should never give Israel the opportunity or the possibility to claim that we, the Palestinians, are the ones who refused the two-state solution.
No.
This should never happen because, you know, in 1947, there was a partition plan, and the Israeli claim that was widely accepted is that Palestinians rejected it and Israelis accepted it, which is not true. The Israelis never accepted it. And a very good Israeli historian whom I respect very well, Avi Schleim, working at Oxford University, has done thorough research and could not identify or find a single paper that shows that the Israeli government accepted the partition plan. So they claim that we are the ones who didn't accept it, and that's why they created Israel over not 54%, but over 78% of Palestine conducting ethnic cleansing. We've got to be careful about that. And that's why today it's very important to explain that the annexation is the killing of the two-state solution.
Yeah, thank you. And now we have some questions about the ongoing corona crisis. So if you could tell us a little about the situation with the COVID-19 in West Bank and Gaza, and how it affects Palestinians, but also I know that the Palestinian Medical Relief Society works a lot with the crisis, and someone asks also if there's something we can do to help.
Yes, please, of course you can help. We have a very serious case because although we were very good in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, over the first three and a half months, we only had 300 cases actually. And 78% of them came from Israel. And, but about 10 days ago or a little bit more, suddenly in Israel, they opened the system and, they opened the system completely, and we had a horrible rise in Israel from 25 cases per day to almost 1,000 cases per day. And then this influenced us, it affected us, because after the removal of the lockdown, we had many visitors coming from, to Hebron in particular, from the Negev, and we had visitors from other places. But in addition to that, the biggest problem we have is that our workers go work in Israel, and when they come back, they bring back the virus with them. So we started about 10 days ago, we started to have community transmission, as they call in medicine. I mean, before that, most of our cases, or almost all our cases of COVID-19, we had them from outside, either in the beginning from tourists, then from Palestinians coming back from other countries, and mainly from Israel through workers. Now we moved into a new situation where we have community infection. And while we had 300 cases in the first 3 months, now we had in less than 10 days, almost 3,500 new cases. It's multiplied by 10 times. We had only 3 deaths in the beginning. Now we have already 15 deaths or 16. It's quite serious. And we are now we declared a total lockdown completely for 5 days for 5 days in the whole of the West Bank. And the problem is that neither us in the West Bank nor our friends in Gaza, our colleagues in Gaza, can tolerate a big spread of the disease. Why? Because while Israel has 4,000 ventilators and respirators for intensive care, we only have 300 or 400 in the West Bank and 87 in the Gaza Strip. So we can't afford to have a big pandemic. We can't afford. Our whole health system will collapse. And we were actually at the edge of collapse because before the lockdown, many hospitals started to have cases and closed down. And that would have meant not only inability to deal with COVID-19, but also inability of the whole health system to deal with other diseases and with other health problems. That's why we advised the government that there should be a lockdown as soon as possible. And then we should not repeat, when the lockdown is over, we should not allow what happened before to happen again. I mean, not using protective measures as properly, as we should. Of course, we cooperate with Ministry of Health, and we are part of the National Commission, which is taking care of Corona issues. But Medical Relief has been the main organization and the avant-garde Palestinian Medical Relief Society in promoting prevention. We've distributed so far more than 700,000 posters, leaflets, etc. We're using social media, we're using radio stations. But more than that, we have thousands of volunteers who are working all over the country, helping the teams of the Ministry of Health, but also taking care of communities, including education about prevention, but also taking care of the daily needs in the field of health. During the last 11 years, we've trained 72,000 young people in first aid. And these teams of volunteers represent the backbone of what we are doing now on the ground. But additionally, Medical Relief runs 50 clinics and health programs in West Bank, in Jerusalem, and in Gaza. And we continue to work nonstop. Now I'm talking to you from the headquarters of Medical Relief while there is a lockdown. We don't stop when there is a lockdown. And we have, in addition to that, 10 mobile clinics that take care of 120 communities in the so-called Area C, which is threatened to be annexed. These are Bedouin communities, small communities that don't have any form of health services except medical relief services. So it's very vital work. And even when the government clinics close down, we continue to work because they are under horrible pressure, of course. So the work we do is very essential. PJS has helped us a little bit with our campaign, but if you can help with medical relief in any way to continue this very vital work, you are most welcome, and you can do it, I think, through PJS.
Thank you. We know that you do fantastic work, and we're so happy that we can support it from our maybe small resources, but still we can do something.
I want also to add that two things I didn't mention is that there is a major work done by Medical Relief also for people with disability. So they are not neglected during this lockdown, as well as with women to fight violence against women, and especially gender-based violence. And also to take care of pregnant women who suffer a lot because of lack of services under their circumstances. So this work with women and with the people with disabilities is also a very essential part of what we are doing.
And one question is, I heard that settler violence increased during the corona crisis when Palestinian families stayed at home. You have anything?
That's very true. Settlers' violence has increased dramatically. It includes attacks on people. It includes attacks on houses of people who are living close to settlements, but also it includes cutting off trees, especially olive trees, and burning trees. Today we had several incidents. And also I forgot to mention to you that the Israeli army has been very vicious with us. I mean, in Jerusalem where we work, they've arrested our volunteers while they were trying to do health education to people who did not receive this health education from Israeli Ministry of Health. So our guys were arrested, they were detained, they were given orders not to enter the old city for 14 days. Even when we organized local committees to disinfect places that are neglected in the old city, some of our guys were again arrested or threatened. But we still continue to do the work. Yes, the Israeli, and also arrests. I mean, 2 days ago, the army was near our house, I mean, inside Ramallah, and they came to arrest a young woman. And they constantly invade cities and villages and places to arrest people or even to demolish homes, like they have done in the village called, in a village called Kobar in Ramallah district.
Thank you. I was going to have a question here about the International Criminal Court, but I have one more follow-up question concerning the COVID-19. There is, of course, a problematic issue with rights-based demonstrations at the times of the pandemic. And as the Palestine nation is under occupation and under threat, how do you think is the best way to deal with big crowds of demonstrations, or maybe many people coming to funerals and so on? How to deal with these kinds of things today? That's a very, I would say, practical question.
Well, we had a difficult situation because from one side we wanted to prevent the infection, and from the other side we had to take actions against Israeli measures because otherwise the Israelis would have claimed that people accept annexation. So we had up till now 4 major events. We had one in Gaza a few days ago, and we had 3 big activities in Jericho, in Fasail in the north of Jordan Valley, and in Bardala in the very upper north of Jordan Valley. I was there in the 3 activities in the West Bank. We tried to use protective methods. So people were advised to have masks and to have gloves. You see, I am wearing the gloves even here now. And we tried to have distances as much as possible. But now with the lockdown, of course, we cannot organize demonstrations. Now, the main problem we had in terms of transmission of infection was weddings. Unfortunately, people tend to weddings without protective material. And that became the main source of transmission in many places, especially Hebron and Bethlehem. Of course, funerals are now banned, the same applies to weddings and so on. And we hope to convince people, these are the messages we are sending now, that people should really respect 4 measures to prevent the spread of infection, which is distancing, physical distancing. By the way, we don't call it social distancing, we call it physical distancing. To wear masks, to wear gloves, and to be careful about how they not to be in big gatherings. These are the 4 methods we are advising, and we hope people will do realize that it is very important to respect these 4 principles.
Thank you. I have a question here. We go back to the annexation, and the question is, what tips would you give Swedish journalists on how to cover the issue of Israel's annexation? Unfortunately, some media editors see Israel's occupation as such an old and tired conflict, and they hesitate to report news about it.
I am disappointed at the media worldwide, to be honest with you. And we are disappointed because really they're not giving us space. We never had such little space since a very long time. And I think that is because of the Israeli vicious propaganda and Israeli vicious pressure on journalists. They have a lobby. The lobby is very well organized. And as soon as somebody writes something right about the situation in Palestine, he will be attacked or she will be attacked. But that's why we think journalists have to be courageous and stand up to these pressures. And we are ready to help them with any information they need. We are ready to help them with interviews. We are ready to help them with facts and information. And we don't want them to be biased. We want them to be objective and to present the facts and reality on the ground. But honestly speaking, we feel that there is little attention paid to the situation in Palestine, including to the issue of annexation. And that is not normal. I mean, it should be more interest in what's happening, and there should be more coverage. I don't know if the amount of coverage of Libya, for instance, now is equal to what's happening in Palestine. I'm doubtful. So I think there is a need here for greater attention, given the sensitivity of the situation here and the risks we are facing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have a question?
Yeah, I have a question about the International Criminal Court. We know about Israel and the US putting big pressure on the ICC to drop any formal charges on Israel military leaders and to terminate any preliminary investigations. What are the biggest threats to the ICC in this respect? What can Israel and the US actually do to impede the investigations and court cases? And what can activists, human rights organizations do to support the ICC, since it's now under big pressure?
ICC is under big pressure, and it made it a bit hesitant in rushing with the issue of investigating the Israeli war crimes, although I think we've provided them with sufficient information and sufficient proofs of the war crimes. But they are still hesitating to start the investigation. And now they are subjected to horrible pressure from Mr. Trump, who practically declared sanctions on the ICC, including preventing its members from entering the United States, and not only the judges and the prosecutors and so on, but even their families. And so the biggest threat to the ICC today are, first of all, the sanctions that are imposed by Mr. Trump. And second, it is the Israeli-American approach of claiming that the ICC has no business in investigating the matter. And that's why I think today the world looks like that. It's the Palestinians, the UN, the ICC on one side, Mr. Trump and Netanyahu on the other side. And we are with the international law, with UN resolutions, and they are with their approach of trying to oppress and dictate. And I think the activists can do a lot here by raising the question of why the United States president has the right to impose sanctions on an international body like ICC. Why does Trump has the right to boycott and sanction even World Health Organization at the moment when we have COVID-19 pandemic? This is nothing but close to fascist behavior. And I wrote an article in the beginning of COVID-19 where I said the world really is suffering a lot because of fierce capitalism and neoliberal capitalism that has ignored health and ignored health research and ignored education and ignored universities and made everything based on only profit and profit and profit. You face it in Sweden even when, with privatization of the hospitals and so on. But that's why we were crushed by COVID-19. The world would have stopped it easily if it had sufficient resources to make tests for every person in the world. And that would have cost only $35 billion versus a disaster economically, which could cost the world $9 trillion, $9,000 billion. So there is a whole problem with the world system. And of course, that behavior, I said in the article that either the world will have a social revolution really to rebalance the system in the world and talk about human economy rather than just market economy, or the world will tend to move in the very dangerous directions like fascism, like happened in 1929. I mean, after 1929 world economic crisis, we had fascism and Nazism and so on. So the world community must react and change the course that we are subjected to. Today, you cannot fight COVID-19 with each country deciding on its own. It's a global problem. The world is one village. And the WHO is the very important structure here, even if it has flaws. It has to be encouraged and supported, not boycotted. And you cannot stop COVID-19 by dealing with, even in the United States, each state does it on its own. I mean, that doesn't work. It's a global problem that requires global reaction. And you cannot say that the world is global when we speak about trade and the movement of capital and investment, but it stops being a global world when we have to fight COVID-19. This is the problem of today's world. But I don't want to distract you from the subject of today.
Thank you. Thank you. Anna, I think you have a question that you found. We're trying to organize the questions at the same time.
In the chat, it's what about the people in other Arab countries? Do you expect reactions against annexation and that this press can force Arab leaders to react?
Yes, we think the peoples of the Arab world are all on our side, and they will be on our side, and they will be against annexation for sure. Some governments have been very strong. Some government has been very strong against annexation, like Jordan in particular, which feels that it is itself threatened by the Israeli actions. Some Arab countries, very few, but some are really normalizing relations with Israel, which is very strange. It's really very strange that, for instance, some companies in one Gulf country have initiated cooperation with Israeli military companies. And that's why there is a movement in the Arab world against this type of normalization and a demand of sanctioning Israel rather than normalizing relations with it. So there are differences between what people want and what governments do. And our strategy is to push people to pressure their governments to support the Palestinian people. But as I said before, Palestinian issue is not an Arab issue only, or an Islamic issue, or a Palestinian even issue alone. The Palestine question is the issue of humanity. It's a human issue that concerns everybody that believes in freedom and international law worldwide, which is exactly what Nelson Mandela said after the success of the struggle against apartheid there. He said that Palestinian issue is now the most important moral issue of our time. And that's what I believe in.
Yeah. And do you have any more questions, Per?
No, this is maybe just a short follow-up to what you were saying there. Someone is writing about that in Kashmir facing a similar situation as Palestine today under India's expansionism and settler colonialist project. And a question if how activists can link the international solidarity for both these places. But you have been into this into a worldwide thought here. Yeah.
It's international. It's respect of human rights everywhere, respect of democracy everywhere, respect of international law everywhere. That's the major principle.
So then we really, really want to say thank you for taking the time to join us and give this clear presentation and answering all the questions. We are really honored and happy about that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your solidarity and for your support. And I hope we can soon be able to say that we managed to get rid of COVID-19 and of the annexation virus as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining today.